Welcome everyone to our fifth plenary talk of the conference. Tonight's topic will be addressing The Dead Will Be Raised Imperishable, Transhumanism, Science Fiction, and the Hope of the Resurrection by Christina Bieber, and I will introduce her momentarily to you. This is a little bit of a different format. We have a very dialogical response, so Christina will be giving an opening presentation. After that, we'll have three respondents. Christina will have a rejoinder, and then you'll have an opportunity to provide your questions for Q&A in the final 30 minutes or so. So for tonight's speakers, our respondents are John R. Wood, who is currently the Interim Executive Director of the American Scientific Association. You've seen his face many a times throughout this conference. Before joining the ASA, he was a professor of biology and environmental studies at King's University in Edmonton, Canada, as well as the Dean of the Natural Sciences. William B. Hurlbut is the adjunct professor and senior research scholar in neurobiology at Stanford Medical School. In addition to teaching at Stanford, he has also worked at NASA on projects in astrobiology and served on the President's Council on Bioethics, among other appointments. Brent P. Waters is the Jerry and Mary Joy Stead Professor of Christian Social Ethics at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and the director of the Stead Center for Ethics and Values. Tonight's speaker, Christina Bieber, is the Clyde S. Kilby Professor of English at Wheaton College. Although a literary professor, Christina's thinking and writing are by no means limited to the interpretation of texts, as tonight's lecture will demonstrate. Rather, she brings current trends, philosophy, theology, and literature together in her attempt to think Christianly about important issues that confront us in our age. This multidisciplinary engagement is evident in her 2013 award-winning book, The Prophets of the Posthuman, American Fiction, Biotechnology, and the Ethics of Personhood, published by Notre Dame Press, as well as her 2019 monograph, Beyond the Story, American Fiction, and the Limits of Materialism, also Notre Dame Press. So Christina, we're delighted to and looking forward to hearing from you this evening. And so I will pass the mic over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I want to thank you and anyone else who's responsible for my invitation to this conference. It has been truly delightful and an honor to be one of the presenters. Interdisciplinary conversations are not easy to have, but they're very important, critical, I think, for the church. So before I begin, let me explain why a literary critic of all people might be involved in these kinds of conversations. I think there are tons of reasons, but the primary one is that stories are quite simply the way we make sense of our lives here. Stories are how we figure out what it means to flourish as a person, what it means to be human. And all of my work is devoted to the conviction that we need stories in order to be able to imagine what our lives could or should look like, or will look like if we're not careful. They become cautionary tales as well. So in short, stories are never just an example for me. I do my theological thinking through them, and that's what I'm attempting to demonstrate here this evening. Well, there's nothing quite like the combination of a global pandemic, an American political crisis, and ongoing news of moral failings in church leadership to make us enter into a deep eschatological despair. It seems that lately, even the church has become susceptible to what I'm calling a hope deficit. Didn't Jesus promise that he would return, and wouldn't now be a great time for that? I'm sure some of us have been saying. So it's not surprising that recent events have led to an increase in the membership of two organizations who believe that Jesus' return is not just to be hoped for, but to be worked for. Neither the Christian Transhumanist Association and the affiliated Mormon Transhumanist Association has a very large membership. But the members they do have are committed to a truly radical marriage of technoscientific optimism and Christian faith. While transhumanists in general tend to be an atheistic or at least a thoroughly naturalistic lot, these groups believe that God is inviting all of us to participate in our own resurrection, and that technoscience is the way that he is going to do it. We will all attain immortality in the here and now by uploading individual consciousnesses into an enhanced or a fully cybernetic body. And what sounds like science fiction to us is to them a nearly certain outcome, provided that we just trust in technoscience to get there. So if these groups are so outre, which they really are, why bother to engage with their ideas? Because they are not only advancing a techno-scientific agenda, but an eschatological vision for the church. And as John Polkinghorne puts it, eschatology is an indispensable element in theological thinking because it responds to the question of the total meaningfulness of the present creation, a meaning that can only finally be found beyond science's extrapolation of contemporary history. So whether the church knows it or not, techno-scientific optimism has kind of slid into our eschatological thinking through the back door. And there's a lot of science that this has happened, but one of the ways is that it keeps our mind on present day solutions to problems that we can affect through science. The glamour of technology is what one writer calls it. And so we're not focused then on growing our faith in God and our trust in God. And furthermore, no one can stop the fact that technoscience is moving rapidly toward what Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity, the age when computers will exceed human intelligence and a truly viable artificial intelligence, an AI, will be built, according to Kurzweil. The church needs faithful eschatology in order to engage with the challenge of AI in general, and specifically with the transhumanist vision of everlasting life. So the purpose of this paper will be first to illustrate how the CTA and the MTA have adapted Christian eschatology to include the transhumanist vision, and second, to illustrate the shortcomings of that adaptation. For although their view of the future seems to be nothing if not fully imaginative, I will argue that it is in fact not imaginative enough. It is instead a thoroughly human vision of resurrection that fails to understand either Christian hope or grace. Like so many failed human efforts, such as the Tower of Babel, it strives for a second best version of the future that proves also to be a hubristic barrier to salvific faith in the God who promises that, like Christ, the dead shall be raised imperishable. A look at some contemporary science fiction will make it clear that God's new creation is genuinely to be longed for because it, by definition, exceeds what any human being can imagine. It's just a much better idea of the future than what we could get from transhumanism. So the CTA and the MTA have regular meetings to share ideas about what it means to have what they call extreme eschatological optimism. And in a January 2021 virtual meeting of the Turing Church, that's what they call it, which is a play on church Turing thesis. But these members, Christopher Bradford, Julio Prisco, Lincoln Cannon, David McFadden, and Micah Redding discussed some of the main convictions. Redding says we have to act. We have to work toward the world we hope for. Julio Prisco argues that this means that the eventual attainment through technoscience of a universal resurrection. As Prisco put it in a web post, my central thesis is that time magic and mind scanning will permit us to resurrect the dead by copying them out, end quote. If this sounds like 21st century postmillennialism, it's because it is. While most of CTA members are amillennial, the leaders acknowledge that their idea of participating with God in the resurrection is built on the central idea of postmillennialism, that the church is responsible for and will have increasing success in creating God's kingdom on earth, eventuating in, and indeed ushering in, Christ's triumphal return. CTA members correctly argue that premillennial forms of Christian theology usually operate in fear of technology, whereas they, on the other hand, are fully embracing of all technology. Redding argues that God's primary purpose is to work with us to, quote, renew the world, renew the cosmos. So for the Christian transhumanist, fear of technoscience is antithetical to hope because it closes us off from the tools that God wants us to use to bring about justice. The CTA believes that its vision of the future is the only one that is both beautiful and compassionate toward every single person who lives today. It's about justice, they say, in the here and now, not waiting around for God to act. That is why, according to Prisco, quote, hope is more important than truth. Now, that's a pretty stunning statement when you think about it, and it'd be fun to talk about that. The members of the Turing Church have an equally human-centered view of grace, although their definition of grace is tellingly a bit different from the Orthodox definition. As Micah Redding puts it, quote, "We aren't waiting for God to do everything. We trust in grace. God has graced us with the means to act," end quote. With this definition of grace, the onus falls on the church to take the gifts of techno-scientific skill and use those gifts responsibly. Prisco, quote, "The promises of religion are true because we will make them true." Our salvation comes by accepting that God has graced us with everything we need to accomplish God's purposes. As Redding argues, quote, "Participating in this process is our salvation. That is the substance of what salvation is," end quote. Now, I think it's worth noting that the Turing Church is committed to decentralization as the primary way that this work will be accomplished, and they're really big on this point. According to Redding, God has always been about decentralization, and this is why Paul, according to Redding, teaches that every member of the body is important, and that the only risk for technology is centralization. That's the only risk in technology, according to these guys. So the strong belief in decentralization is the only way to our ultimate salvation, whatever that really means, is part of the reason why, as one Reddit user put it, crypto is God and his prophet is Elon Musk. I just love this picture of Elon Musk of the Doge coin thing. So how does this view of the eschaton, and particularly of the role of hope and grace, map onto the Orthodox Christian view? Can one really be a Christian transhumanist? Well, since hope is claimed by these guys to be more important than truth, hope is a good starting point for engagement with these issues. Joseph Pieper, in his wonderful little book On Hope, reminds us that hope is a theological virtue which has certain ramifications, in defining it that way. Theological virtue is the steadfast orientation toward fulfillment and a beatitude that are not owed to natural man. Theological virtue is the utmost degree of a supernatural potentiality for being. This supernatural potentiality for being is grounded in a real, grace-filled participation in the divine nature which comes to men through Christ. And indeed, argues Pieper, if hope is not a theological virtue, meaning it entails the need to trust in God for his definition of the good, then it cannot be considered a virtue at all. Because think about it, natural hope can be ordered towards something other than the supreme good, the summum bonum. Pieper's a great Thomist. For example, you can hope all that you want that you would one day become the richest person on earth, but that's probably not God's best for you. So the object of our hope matters. So from this starting point, Pieper argues that there are two kinds of hopelessness, despair and presumption. Now, for the Christian, it's easy to see that to be in despair is a decision against Christ, a denial, Pieper says, of the redemption. The Turing Church folks thus rightly understand that this kind of despair has no place among believers. But the other error, which is presumption, is the result of having too much confidence that our redemption will occur in the way that we imagine it. Indeed, that it has already happened and we just need to possess it. And this is precisely where Christian transhumanism goes astray. Pieper argues that presumption is the will, quote, to achieve a certainty that is necessarily invalid because there's no valid ground for it. Even more specifically, this false esteem of oneself is a lack of humility, a denial of one's actual creatureliness, and an unnatural claim to being like God, end quote. This is a great point. There's no ground for this certainty because it rests not in the promise of God, but in the individual's own achievement. This actually removes the ground for true hope, removes it, which depends on the recognition, and Pieper's big on this point, that we are creatures, not God. One of the ways to recognize when a hope is actually presumption and not hope is to consider the role of prayer. Now, obviously, the person who is in despair does not pray at all. But one who is in the error of presumption petitions God, but, quote, his petition is not genuine because he fully anticipates its fulfillment, end quote. So it's not really prayer at all. Now, I want to be fair here. Some members of CTA and MTA understand that humility is essential when it comes to keeping the extraordinary power of technoscience decentralized. But not all of them buy humility as an important virtue. Prisco, for example, writes, quote, "I consider humility as a dirty word and agree with Ronald Bailey's commentary that the most dangerous idea is banning technological progress in the name of humility," end quote. This is an example of a typical straw man argument, as if to say those arguing against the kind of presumption that Pieper is talking about could only be against advances in technoscience. But this not need be the case. Instead, we need to move closer to the root to see what humility really is, what it is about God's work in our lives that occasions humility as a response. And here is where the Turing Church is exposed. There is no humility because there is no accurate understanding of grace. To say that God has graced us with the ability to participate in our own resurrection is at best an incomplete understanding of grace as a gift. And as Albert Borgman points out, and he's just a great philosopher dealing with technology. If you haven't read him, you really should. The effort to be in control of our future destiny is in an inverse relationship with our ability to receive grace, right? The more you think you're in control, the less you need grace. It is instead when we experience contingency, and especially the suffering that comes along with contingency, that we truly understand grace. This is a very important part of growing our faith in God, as we will see later on. So it turns out that the question of who is really in control, God or us, is precisely the key issue here. Leaders of the CTA and MTA acknowledge that many of their ideas come from Russian cosmism, as identified with the modern cosmist mystic Nikolai Fedorov. Prisco writes that Fedorov was one of the first modern thinkers to suggest that science was a tool given to us by God to enable us to resurrect the dead and, as promised, enjoy immortal life. At the heart of cosmist thinking is the concept of what they call, quote, active evolution, that it is God's will that we take the wheel of evolution into our own hands. Prisco explains that, quote, one of Fedorov's favorite Bible passages was, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than those will he do." I admit that this verse presents a clear challenge to my argument above. After all, we don't stop working for justice here just because we know that our execution of justice is inherently flawed. Jesus raised people from the dead, so why shouldn't we if we are promised to do greater things than him? Well, one way to answer this important question is to drill down into the view of Jesus and his teaching that is on offer here. When you take modern technoscience per se out of the equation, Fedorov's ideas are hardly new. Ralph Waldo Emerson also considered Jesus to be more important as a representative man than as God. The point of the Gospels was, for Emerson, to give us a model of an original thinker and to emulate him in his originality, not to actually obey him. The further one digs into cosmism and its direct inheritor, transhumanism, the more evident it becomes that Jesus is much more our cosmic cheerleader than he is our savior or the source of our only real power. The tell is that the focus is solely on the end result, immortal life through our engineered resurrection. There is no focus at all on either worship or the need to constantly seek God's will or on learning to be more like Jesus for the sake of his kingdom. There's none of that there. Transhumanism is instead ultimately focused on the end, that humans would become better than well, live forever, and there's just no concern for growing more like Jesus along the way. Now, Aquinas, among others, taught that any such focus on the end is inherently disordered. It substitutes our goal for God's goal, which it presumes to know. And of course, these are just the beginnings of the theological problems. The promise Jesus made to his disciples that they will do greater things is built on the premise that the disciples remain in the vine, in Jesus himself. And to me, this is fundamental to the church's response to bioethics in general. Of course, we want to use medicine to heal people, to lessen suffering, to help people to flourish. But we do these things well only if we also care for people's souls. Because actually to give them what they think they want might be to deprive them of the opportunity to experience God in their suffering, in the contingency that Borgman was talking about. Now, I obviously don't have space to develop this argument here, but I want to strongly recommend Elmore Stump's magisterial book, Wandering in Darkness, Narrative and the Problem of Suffering. And part of the reason for this recommendation is that I want to stand on Stump's solid foundation of the importance of narrative instead of propositional argument when it comes to questions about how we should think about human suffering. Job factors big in her analysis. Transhumanism definitely considers aging to be a disease that causes suffering and that therefore should be cured. Through narrative, and really only through narrative, we can learn what we lose today by taking our resurrection into our own hands through technoscience. For although the leaders continue to insist that their position actually represents, continue to insist that they are the radical theological optimists who have dared to imagine a beautiful future, they're the only ones, I would argue that their position actually represents a failure of theological imagination. While they see themselves as seeing along with God, they actually turn God's will for us into a merely human and thus inferior construct of a utopian future. Now, how are we going to see this? We've got to look at what a humanly engineered techno-scientific resurrection might actually look like. And this is where we can have some fun with science fiction. The best imaginative work that I have seen on this is that of the Scottish sci-fi novelist Ian Banks. Banks wrote 9 novels and at least 2 short stories directly centered on a highly technologically evolved humanoid civilization called the Culture with a capital C. The Culture has already achieved everything the Russian cosmists dreamt about. Because they are able to upload consciousness into a computer, anyone who desires a backup can have one. So you can take your body for a dalliance with all kinds of danger without any concern for ultimate death. Furthermore, they have practically eliminated contingency as a cause of physical death. For example, Culture and citizens enjoy lava rafting. So if you're out lava rafting and you get too close to being burnt to a crisp, a robot will dash down at the last minute and rescue you. That's the way that Culture works. And finally, because of these advances in technoscience, Culture has completely eliminated scarcity. All of Culture's planets and orbitals, which are their man-made planets, are ruled by flawless artificial intelligences called minds with capital M. Anything a citizen needs or wants can be supplied by the minds, including new bodies, feel-good chemicals that you can gland, much like the feelies in Brave New World, and an infinite variety of entertainments. Now, since Banks' novels imagine a fully realized techno-utopia, they deserve our careful consideration. And a close reading of one of these novels, Look to Windward, will reveal there's something rotten in Culture's paradise. To the extent that the minds and other Culture citizens are motivated by anything but pleasure, it's power and control, not love for other civilizations. In short, eliminating scarcity and physical contingency does not magically solve the problem of being human and human sin. It certainly doesn't solve the problem of either defining or achieving what could be called the good life. The plot of Look to Windward is way too complicated to trace here. Now, it comes down to one non-Culture world, the Chelgrians, seeking revenge on Culture for the mistakes they made when they were interfering with their civilization. Culture interferes with all the other civilizations. In this case, Culture interference made things worse because it sparked a civil war in Chelgria, an outcome for which they are only vaguely apologetic. They don't apologize for anything. They're very arrogant. The first thing to note is that the Culture novels have only plots. They only have plots because of this interference for what's a story without conflict, right? That's also interesting. If you do away with all scarcity, then where's the conflict going to lie? But Banks' novels use this conflict only to fully imagine what life in Culture might look like. And it turns out not to be as utopian as it seems. First, as you might expect, eliminating one's final death is not necessarily the best way to flourish as a human being. Over thousands of years, people become bored and to varying degrees at different times choose actual death as a matter of fashion. As a non-culture character muses, momentous. They lived or died by whim. A few of their more famous people announced they would live once and die forever, and billions did likewise. Then a new trend would start among opinion formers for people to back up and have their bodies wholly renewed or new ones regrown, or to have their personalities transferred into android replicas or some other more bizarre design, or, well, anything. There was really no limit. But the point was that people would start doing that sort of thing by the billion too, just because it's become fashionable. Clearly, man-made immortality has not answered for Augustinian restlessness. And it simply cannot, because there's no God to rest in here. There's only the fashion of the moment. Predictably, in order to feel something, certain people in the culture go lava surfing or take other risks without backups. So that to make them feel alive. And this has created a subset of culture citizenry called the disposables. Others who are more risk averse simply travel the galaxy playing games or seeking entertainments in new places. As the Chelgrian character Ziller reflects, they spend time. That's just it. They spend time traveling. The time weighs heavily on them because they lack any context, any valid framework for their lives. And then Ziller provides this inadvertently Augustinian analysis. They persist in hoping that something they think they'll find in the place they're heading for will somehow provide them with the fulfillment they feel certain they deserve and yet have never come close to experiencing. This is a pretty profound Augustinian analysis. This novel thus provides a glimpse at what a society who has cheated death for thousands of years might actually look like. The answer is not surprising. All the societies that reach this level of progress eventually abandon faith in God completely. In their perspective, without death, there's no need for God, which is a cultural construct anyway. Although there's no evidence that this is a problem for Banks, who is an atheist, he does acknowledge that there's an isolated coldness in it. Individuals are necessarily merely numbers in a wide and meaningless universe, not persons placed within a meaningful cosmos. When the Chelgrian protagonist, a soldier named Quilin, loses his wife, and she really dies because there was no backup, Banks gives us this revelatory passage, which is from Quilin's point of view. Gone, utterly gone and forever. Gone in a way that was new, bereft of the comforts of ignorance, and without appeal. Before, we believed that the soul might be saved. Now our technology, our better understanding of the universe, and our vanguard in the beyond has robbed us of our unreal hopes and replaced them with its own rules and regulations, its own algebra of salvation and continuance. It has given us a glimpse of heaven and made more intense the reality of our despair when we know that truly it exists and that those we love will never be found there. Wow. Quilin's musings are remarkably resonant with what I see as the logical end of Christian transhumanism. If we are responsible for our own resurrection, that can only mean that heaven will be here on earth and that we make it possible. And why would anyone need God in that scenario? If the church participates in transhumanism's vision, we will see increasing numbers of people who see the hope in a loving God as unreal and unnecessary and simply let it go. Christian faith and hope will be replaced with a coldly impersonal algebra of salvation and continuance. Note that Quilin, having lost whatever former Chelgrian faith in an afterlife he once had, now believes that this techno-scientific continuance is, in fact, the only heaven on offer. And since the woman he loves will not be there, he would rather die himself. Banks reveals that in a materialistic, metaphysically meaningless universe, suicide for the world-weary is not only a reasonable option, but a strongly attractive one. The only other option on offer in his fictional world is something called subliming, which is when an individual or a mind, can do this as well, surrenders to a complete Gnostic release of the particular embodiment and identity in order to join a large interconnected network of minds. That's what subliming is. This view of AI is very common in science fiction. It's the network in Ghost in the Shell, the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica, the hosts in Westworld, or the Borg in Star Trek. The networked mind is alternately described by these writers as either a heaven or a hell, but it is notably always necessarily somewhat abstract, with individual minds subservient to the greater whole. Banks might just be the most honest of all sci-fi writers, for he simply acknowledges that, like any heaven, since no one has actually returned from being sublimed, no one knows what it's really like. Now, I think it's possible that Christian transhumanists have not considered that the end of the project to achieve our own resurrection could end up with something that looks like subliming, not like the promised new heaven and new earth of the Bible, which is clearly embodied and particular, unified by obedience of the diverse individual members to Christ. Subliming is supremely Gnostic because the particular material instantiation of one's mind has no meaning at all. It can only be an impediment. The body is an impediment. But why wouldn't subliming be a heaven on earth? Although I don't have space to go into it here, I will offer one starting point. A close consideration of the Tower of Babel episode suggests that when it comes from a human starting point, any effort to unify and reach into the heavens is necessarily problematic, in part because the outcome can only be an abstract, constructed, and imperfect unity. Someone will always lose in this scenario. That's the point that C.S. Lewis makes in Abolition of Man. One way to read this story is that in his mercy, God gave the gift of greater human diversity as a part of the punishment for the original human hubris, forgetting that we are the created and not the creator. So the Tower of Babel effort is in stark contrast to Pentecost, of course, in which human diversity, exemplified by the different cultures and languages, is unified in the power of the Holy Spirit. The diversity is not lost. I can't imagine a subliming scenario that actually keeps diversity. Now, how does a biblically grounded theological imagination offer something superior to the vision supplied by Christian transhumanism? It's a tough question. The Anglican priest and scientist John Polkinghorne, especially in his book, The God of Hope and the End of the World, suggests some ways to think about it. This book was Polkinghorne's effort to make more accessible the academic findings of a 3-year meeting of a group of scholars at the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton. Their task was to reconsider eschatology in light of contemporary scientific and theological understanding, and it eventuated in the book, The End of the World and the Ends of God. Ironically, I first heard about Polkinghorne's book when it was mentioned by Prisco in the Turing Church conversation above. He cited the book in support of their position about radical hope of God working through science, but it would seem that the Turing Church members have not read the book closely enough. For Polkinghorne's main thesis is that theologians must consult science so that their eschatology illustrates both continuity and discontinuity with creation as it is. The discontinuity is essential for us in order to understand that God's ways are above our ways. For to have a perfect world without decay or loss is not possible according to the laws of physics as we understand them today. Transhumanism, as can easily be seen, is only about continuity. With the miraculous as yet to be discovered by science, their imagination is necessarily confined to the materially possible. This is not only unorthodox, it's also profoundly sad. I think it's a kind of acquiescence to the meaningless gray world of the culture novels in which human restlessness, even amidst the full satiation of all of our desires and needs, can find no resolution. There's no resting in God. Polkinghorne insists that only humility will leave us open to the discontinuity of the new creation that yields true hope. So when Polkinghorne allows himself to dream what a world without pain and suffering and restlessness will look like, he fittingly turns to music. He says we need to rid ourselves of the vestiges of the Platonic notion that perfection is static and to replace it with an altogether more dynamic concept. Music should indeed be our guiding image, not sculpture. Each one of Bach's Goldberg variations is perfect in itself, and we do not need to opt for just one of them. They present us with an image of change without either repetition or loss. It is the exploration of the endless variations of divine perfection that will constitute the harmony of the heavenly realm. How otherwise could finite beings encounter the infinite? I think it's worth carefully considering how little or much this metaphor can be realized by Christian transhumanism's view of resurrection. Divinely instigated human resurrection, the clear biblical promise of a new creation, new actual bodies, is truly diverse and truly unified. There is simply no way to achieve perfect justice, peace, and harmony by simply resurrecting our minds into new bodies. Sin will remain as long as there is freedom to act. To use Polkinghorne's metaphor, some of the individual variations would be out of tune, even ugly or destructive. Subliming, on the other hand, might be harmonious, but at what cost to the beauty of diversity? Although Polkinghorne's metaphor breaks down because it's not about persons per se, he understands that transhumanism's radical human optimism is blind to this fact, that without God and love at the center of our discoveries of the diverse riches of God's creation, there will be no justice, peace, or unity. It cannot be the new heaven and the new earth. Unless God builds the house, the laborers labor in vain. So to put it very simply, without Jesus as the power behind and the goal of our transformation, we will be left to our own devices on earth. So while I do think it is possible that one day scarcity will be eliminated and that we can learn to live forever or close to it, this outcome will not be the good we imagine it to be. We will become first sated and then ultimately bored. In this scenario, what will cause us to seek God? What will cause us to learn to love better? I think the start of the passage in 1 Corinthians 15 tells us everything we need to know. Listen, Paul says, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. Paul tells his readers to listen closely. This is a mystery. The trumpet will sound, and our change will be instantaneous, complete, beautiful, and completely unprecedented. We will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And in this promise lies all our hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. Now our first respondent is John Wood.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you to my colleagues at the Henry Center for this opportunity to respond to Christina's paper. To say that I appreciate her approach is actually an understatement. I almost felt like I was back in my literature class at North Park College there in Chicago many years ago. And it's just so fun to do that. This interdisciplinary approach that you're taking is both challenging and rewarding. And those of us who work in interdisciplinary scholarship know that. But it is also vital in our day. And so I want to put that in some context and talk about why I think that's so. To say that something is broken in our public discourse is a truism. If the sciences and technology are to continue being a good gift, many recognize that we must re-engage conversations across the arts and the sciences. At the opening of the space race here in the United States, we discovered that we'd fallen behind technologically. I vividly recall that week when Sputnik was launched. We were in our 5th grade class, and the teacher came in later in the week, and she held up a newspaper, and she said, "Class, this will be our science, our social studies, our writing lessons for the rest of the year." She was a wise and seasoned teacher. She moved very quickly to grab the attention of these 10-year-olds. Later in high school, we were reading from the new BSCS textbooks that had appeared. So that was here in the United States. Across the ocean in England, C.P. Snow was announcing that 2 cultures had grown up. Here he describes tribes speaking at each other with mutual incomprehension. Something was broken in the public, and the public was convinced that the focus on science education was going to be the thing that would fix it. To many, it seemed that the arts and humanities would languish in the face of this rising research university. The knowledge gained in applied science and technology launched what Clark Kerr called the multiversity of hyperspecialization. Yet 6 decades later, the value of interdisciplinary conversation is greater than it has ever been. The questions facing us are what the social scientists call wicked problems. They're complex and dynamic. They're filled with conflicting ends that must be engaged in a rich contextual view, all for the common good. So your book, which emphasizes, and your talk tonight, which emphasizes the place of storytelling in firing the moral imagination, is really welcome. But expectations and practices are not changing uniformly. And there could be misplaced faith in the power of the sciences to solve our ills, to stabilize our economy, and to give us hope. And I think in transhumanism, we're seeing that hope that's placed there in technology. Describing society today, you note that people expect much more from medical technology than a mere cure for disease. Technological enhancements are marketed with the language of illness and pathology, in which a problem is named and a treatment is prescribed. You look at it, it sounds a bit like marketing meets science, right? With a guarantee for the good life. And so I think that's a challenge. Do we really need God's help anymore? In segments of our public discourse, we seem to be doing well enough without him, except perhaps as a backstop, in case we run out of ideas. But the hook in your story is that the more Americans put their trust in science to solve problems, the more alienated from their true predicament they become. And I would say you're not the only person I've read in the humanities that's making this case, and I think that's important for us to open our ears and hear. Transhumanism, you conclude, is illustrative of our dilemma. It turns out that the question of who is really in control, God or us, is precisely the key issue. This is a test of faith, and it's not new. It was there for Cain when he walked in the field. It was there for Queen Esther at court. It was there for Peter on the lake, as it is for us today in the laboratory. Interestingly, you have framed it following Fulkerson, not as a science question, but as an eschatological dilemma of the imaginative short-sightedness. The pivot point of transhumanism away from historic Christianity is that these individuals believe that God is inviting all of us to participate in our own resurrection. So theologians, I think, are going to have some interesting things to say about that, especially in the context of the Tower of Babel. This engaging paper places the promise of transhumanism in contrast with a rich reading of scriptures. Listening in as you engage science fiction authors has, especially for those of us in the natural and social scientists, it stirred our imagination. It's given us fruitful lines for thinking and rethinking the techniques and questions that are being raised here. The challenge in this cautionary tale is in mapping the philosophical and theological insights onto the technological developments that are rapidly emerging from the pace of change is enormous. And that's a challenge. I want to turn now to what I call the necessity of death, because I think there's a thing. I'm an ecologist, so I think there's something here. It's in suffering, fear, and death that can help us in thinking here. Talking about death is especially challenging for us. I'm an ecologist, but if ecology is a life science, why do we ecologists spend all of our time studying death and dying things? Population ecology, and it's my specialty, is all about regulatory factors and what we call euphemistically disturbance. Behavioral ecology engages in competition, exclusion, and all of these things are mediated by dying. Our theory and our practice revolve around contest, competition, and disturbance, stress and predation, consumption, and natural selection. Yet ecologists, we deal with these death-dealing mechanisms, but we rarely name them. While reading the anthropologist Ernst Becker a while back on the denial of death, I was challenged to ask, do we professionally deny death? Death is pervasive in ecological relationships. Living systems are animated by every level of mortality, physical cessation, and endings. Nothing in ecology makes sense apart from death. Through long and often deeply tragic and personal association, it is difficult for us to see death as anything but evil in our lives. If death is present, then something must be wrong. Yet this is a moral, a personal, a theological, it's an emotional judgment. And we heard the problematics on our understanding of emotion last evening and thinking about mental health and well-being. It just doesn't adequately represent our understanding of an ecological role of death in biotic systems. As I said, it animates at every level. And it's not just natural selection or extinction, which people often go to those two. If we use the imagination of a biologist, then we see that without death, there is no community. There's no ecosystem to talk about. There's no biosphere as we know them. Recent theoretical and empirical work in ecology, as well as in medicine and developmental biology, has focused on the role of programmed cell death, that is, in regulating bodily structures. Ecologists are now linking the smallest cellular events, genetic and physiologically, with oceanographic and planetary biochemical processes. Even the regulating of the atmosphere, all of those things that happen are mediated by dying. And that creates the conditions in which life flourishes. I sometimes say to my students, ecology is about eat and be eaten. It's both of those things. Researchers tracking the origin of predation have taken a turn into deep time and the symbiotic origins of cell organelles, for instance, like the mitochondria we've been talking about. They're seeing the roots of multicellularity in death and dying. So this understanding of life will continue challenging conventional understandings and views of Genesis, the linking sin, the fall, to bodily death and complex ecological processes. And I'm well aware that theologians know this and are beginning to deal with it, and that's an interesting turn. So I'm a Christian, but if Christianity is a religion of hope and new life, why do we Christians speak about death? And then we move quickly past that to resurrection. Easter is centered on death, but the focus is on this new hope, the harrowing of hell by Jesus, a wonderful agricultural metaphor of his work there, raising the dead in Christ. There is also, though, the celebration of communion, that focus on brokenness and shed blood and a pathway to renewed covenantal relationship. But physical death, much like the conversation last night about mental health and spiritual well-being, is intertwined with spiritual dying. Or better, as theologian Robert Jensen said, the unbeing of us. We Christians, the eco-theologian Paul Santmeyer reminds us, are unable to deny death. A religion, he notes, that has a crucified Messiah as its fulcrum hardly permits that. So I was challenged, do we believers actually practically deny the death that we claim by faith? So here at the intersection of two major aspects of my life sits this discomforting question, is death a necessity? Ecologically, the answer is clearly yes. Physical death is a regulatory mechanism. It prevents runaway population abundance. My God, why have you forsaken me? These words of Jesus are some of the most fearful ever spoken. We sense the loss. We hear the bitter cry of human hopelessness in those words. Without God, in death, we are utterly alone. That is to be feared. We spiral into the oblivion of non-being, into utter nothingness. Talking about physical death is troubling for us, yet here is Jesus facing his own death in this paradoxical way. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, it says in Hebrews. Physical death is not an option for him. It's not an option for us. Without the witness of his resurrection, death would leave us empty of relationship and bereft of hope. Physical death is a necessary gateway, but a new life of restored being, of relationship and agency is the hope secured in the once again living Christ. And that's not by our undoing. This is God's plan and his action. Rethinking physical death in the context of ecology, theology, psychology, and the humanities will be, I think, a powerful exercise for better understanding both of God's good stories, the story of nature and the story of Scripture. So thank you so much for opening this avenue for us.
Thank you, John. And next we have Brent Waters.
A good paper is well written, insightful, and engaging. Professor Lake does not disappoint. I assume, however, that my role as a respondent is not to spend my allotted time praising her, but to create a kerfuffle or two. I shall try to accomplish that goal by asking questions and suggesting areas where some clarification or elaboration might prove worthwhile. Professor Lake's description of CTA's truncated account of resurrection is precise and it is fair. Too fair, even too polite. What is offered is not resurrection, for to be resurrected requires that one must first die. Transhumanists want to avoid dying for a very long time, perhaps forever. Consequently, they switch their hope away from being raised to eternal fellowship with the triune God in exchange for the immortality of endless time. Yet this is not hope at all, for time cannot be endless, otherwise it is not time. As Professor Lake indicates, human flourishing is predicated on a fitting end, which transhumanists are relentlessly trying to avoid. Transhumanists want to live forever, so the object of their hope is that they will be clever enough to develop the technology to satisfy their desire. CTA's proffered resurrection is, in at best, Pelagian bluster. Their account of resurrection is more akin to Babel than Easter, and they effectively create a cruel God who, rather than offering grace, dispenses cheap advice: keep trying. A question. Professor Lake, are you tempted to accuse CTA of heresy? This is not a flippant question. If Prisco really believes that hope is more important than truth, and it represents a denial of Christian eschatology that centers on the resurrected Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Genuine hope is true, and it is not a fantasy. The allegation of heresy is not meant to condemn, but to indicate what is at stake in any conversation that the church might undertake with CTA. For hope must not only be evocative, but also truthful. For Christian transhumanists, resurrection is the end of the story. But that is not true. It is not the end. Christ's resurrection anticipates his return. If Easter were the final chapter of the gospel, then Jesus would be merely a heroic martyr that God rewards for a job well done, and not the Redeemer and hope of the world. Moreover, there is an important link between the empty tomb and the return, namely the ascension. Resurrection and ascension are two aspects of a singular event in which God vindicates his creation, and Christ is affirmed as the world's Redeemer, ruler, and hope for the future. As far as I know, Christian transhumanists have little to say, if anything, about the ascension and return, because they don't need them. Resurrection alone will do as a kind of vague symbolic reward, should they exhibit sufficient willpower and technical prowess to achieve the goal of immortality. Mm-hmm. To be clear, I'm not taking Professor Lake to task for not mentioning the ascension. Rather, I hope she will accept my comments as a friendly footnote. Next, I want to expand upon Banks' novels by contending that transhumanists are on their way toward constructing the dystopias he decries, and CTA is wittingly or unwittingly an ally in this project. What makes transhumanist rhetoric so chilling is the relentless fixation on autonomy and the elimination of risk. Transhumanists are endeavoring to recreate humans as independent and invulnerable beings. They effectively want to eliminate the risk of depending on undependable others, For transhumanists, the fully autonomous post-human is the eschatological horizon. But invulnerable autonomy carries a heavy price. Alterity is effectively jettisoned. The other is never encountered as an other. The other is simply an object of curiosity or means of entertainment to pass the time away. And subliming is not a solution, because networking is no substitute for relationships that cannot or should not ever be entirely mastered or controlled. In short, transhumanists are striving to construct a loveless world. Love always entails risk. To love an other requires taking a risk. To be and to remain vulnerable, the very condition transhumanists are dedicated to removing from the human condition. The object of hope is not a beloved community or anything resembling it, but survival. To survive for as long as possible, perhaps indefinitely. Consequently, the future envisioned by transhumanists consists of isolated beings constantly on the move, but never arriving anywhere. They search for a discarded love that can never be recovered. Transhumanist eschatology is dystopian because love proves to be an unnecessary burden, best relieved in a quest for immortality. Christian transhumanists are especially culpable because they have effectively collapsed the commands to love God and neighbor into an insular self-regard. Supposedly, this is necessitated by accepting God's grace to manufacture our own salvation. But I suspect that it is little more than a thin disguise for feeding what Iris Murdoch characterizes as the fat, relentless ego. If true, then what is needed is an alternative diet of risky love to counter safe surviving. I don't have much confidence that theologians are up to the challenge. We are remarkably inept and unconvincing at describing both the risks and joys of love, upon which human flourishing depends. I think we will need to turn to novelists to do the job, to draw upon stories already written and those that need to be written. I wonder if Professor Lake concurs, or to pose a question, to counter the allure of transhumanism, despite its counterfeit hope as exemplified by the CTA, should we talk more about writing, especially fiction, in terms of Christian calling and vocation? Hope is a powerful storyline, but its telling needs to be compelling. Finally, transhumanists are not at all happy with their bodies. Embodiment is the nemesis of human flourishing as they understand it. For bodies constrain what we can do, and they wear out over time. In short, humans are finite and mortal beings, and this is an intolerable misfortune. The body is a problem to be solved, and transhumanists intend to solve it by manufacturing superior substrata to host the immaterial information comprising a person. If resurrection is at all pertinent, then it is a symbol more akin to shedding a cocoon than leaving a tomb. Christian transhumanists tend to evade this issue, for seeing the body as a problem to be solved is tantamount to despising the handiwork of the Creator. Humans are creatures, which necessarily means they are finite and they are mortal. Moreover, this creaturely condition is affirmed by God, for in the incarnation, the Word is made flesh, the Creator becomes a creature. As C.S. Lewis puts it, Christianity thoroughly approves of the body, and more broadly affirms the goodness of matter and materiality. Some may find this affirmation rather crude and unspiritual. God does not. He likes matter. He invented it. Or as Beth Felker Jones has written, in the Christian tradition, the temptation to denigrate the body has been continually reasserted and consistently rejected. My reason for belaboring embodiment is that we are in one of those moments when we are being tempted to once again denigrate the body. Transhumanists are capturing public attention, and their influence has leached into mainstream medicine in which aging is called a disease that can be treated and presumably cured. But the dualistic separation of body and soul presupposed by transhumanists is unscriptural and unchristian, and I suspect unscientific. Humans are psychosomatic creatures, simultaneously embodied souls and ensouled bodies. Hope does not reside in being freed from bodies, but being redeemed as embodied creatures. If the body comes to be regarded as a problem to be solved, then we will create moral hazard for both health care and, more broadly, how we love and care for one another. When the fantasy of immortality supplants the reality of death, the floodgates of all kinds of mischief are opened. I close with a couple of questions. Is the hope of resurrection necessarily a hope in the resurrection of the body? The 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians is a mysterious rendering of this hope. But should we suppose that this hope is directed toward an embodied or disembodied future? These are important questions, for how they are answered will shape in part, perhaps in large part, how we act, how we treat and care for one another in the here and now as the finite, immortal creatures we were created to be. Thanks again, Christine, for a wonderful paper.
Thank you, Brent. And finally, we have William Hurlbut.
So I'm pleased to have this opportunity to respond to such a thoughtfully and gracefully written essay. I have very little by way of criticism or counterbalance to add, since, to my mind, Christina has artfully exposed the fundamental errors of the transhumanist agenda. So the best I can do in these comments is to extend some of her insights with the perspectives of one trained in biology and medicine. I, for one, don't feel the deep eschatological despair or the hope deficit that she mentions, but I do share her concern about the marriage of techno-scientific optimism and Christian faith. And not just for the hyperbolic projections of the Christian transhumanists. Rapid advances at the convergence of information and biotechnologies are delivering practical and conceptual challenges at the very foundations of our self-understanding and our sense of place within the natural order. I'm the co-leader of a large-scale, multi-year interdisciplinary project based at Stanford entitled The Boundaries of Humanity, Humans, Animals, and Machines in the Age of Biotechnology. And this project is designed to specifically address these underlying issues. So among my colleagues in this project at Stanford are some very thoughtful scholars and scientists who share our foundations of faith in Christ and our concerns for the way these new powers can be understood and guided to best serve the coming of the kingdom of God. So while trust in technoscience to deliver the resurrection by, quote, uploading individual consciousness into an enhanced or fully cybernetic body seems patently absurd, such proposals do bring to focus some very real and very important issues raised by our advancing powers over human life. What is the connection between our embodied form and the spiritual purposes of our lives? What is our proper role within the natural order? What is the relationship between the given and the good? And what does it mean to be co-creators in the healing of the world? And how does our work on Earth relate to wider cosmic purpose and our eternal destiny in Christ? How we think about these questions has both immediate practical impact and wider eschatological implications. As John Polkinghorne says, they are matters related to the total meaningfulness of the present creation. And as Christina points out, in our technological age, answers to these ultimate issues are somehow smuggled in as we engage the immediate benefits of our technology. Together with a general trend to regard life's challenges, from restless anxiety to natural aging, as bioengineering problems, There is, at least in the culture of Silicon Valley, an almost religious commitment to utopian ideas of technological transcendence. It's interesting that the prophets of this transhumanist religion tend to be philosophers and engineers. Biologists and physicians are much less common in their ranks. I'm friends with Ray Kurzweil. In fact, I'm the bad guy in his movie Transcendent Man. I'm the guy that says that his projections are not well-founded. Ray is a very likable and very smart person, but he sees the world through the eyes of an engineer in a way that does not accord with the organic complexity of living beings. And this brings us to the scientific shortcomings of the Christian transhumanist vision, which seems to me to be deracinated from reality like some floating fantasy. First, a few comments on the transhumanists' extreme eschatological optimism that, quote, time magic and mind scanning will permit us to resurrect the dead by copying them out. This seems to me a good example of putting into practice their own proclamation that hope is more important than truth. In truth, how the conscious mind relates to or arises from biological structures remains a matter of deep mystery. Ray Kurzweil projects that by 2029, we will have reversed engineered the brain and produced a silicon-based simulation capable of carrying the full subtlety and suppleness of the human mind. That strikes me as wildly optimistic technologically. But even if it were true that we could produce some kind of simulacrum of mental operation, that is a long way from the capacity to scan and download an individual consciousness while preserving and sustaining the flow of ongoing personal identity. There are an estimated 100 billion interconnected neurons in the brain and at least as many supportive glial cells associated with the processes of synaptic transmission. These neurons fire on average 200 to 400 times a second and connect to hundreds and in some cases thousands of other neurons. By some estimates, there are quadrillion synaptic connections. Exactly how one could monitor and record such neuronal activity without interfering in the brain's function remains entirely unexplained. More fundamentally, this simplistic wires and switches notion of brain operation is off base. The human person is a psychophysical unity. The brain is intimately embedded within the wider processes of the human body and its ongoing relations with the external world and, of course, the social world. Nutrients, oxygen levels, pH, and internally generated hormonal signals all influence the activity of individual cells and circuits, potentiating some of them and inhibiting others. It's like we have many brains at once. The brain takes in an estimated 11 million bits of sensory information per second, all of which is distilled, filtered, and evaluated against a distinct backdrop of individual memory and personal aspirations. Deprived of this ongoing sensory input, as happens in a sensory deprivation chamber, mental operation rapidly dissociates and is replaced with extreme anxiety and hallucinations. These sensory inputs, together with our internally generated feelings and sense of location in space and time, constitute the foundations for continuity of personal identity and the autobiographical self. As the eminent neurologist Antonio Damasio explains, the body, as represented in the brain, constitutes, quote, the indispensable frame of reference for the neural processes that we experience as the mind. Our thinking is in and through our bodily being. Moreover, even logical reasoning is not literal, but metaphorical. The very structures of our categories and concepts come from the nature of our bodily experience, the world as we know it by living in it. Time, for example, is understood by the representations of our body movement through the experience of being a body moving in space. These primary bodily based concepts then serve as metaphors for abstract concepts such as the force of a reasoned argument or the attraction of love. There is no mind separate from and independent of the body, and no pure reason apart from bodily experience. Moreover, our similar human experience as embodied minds provides the shared terms of thought and language that make possible complex communication and cooperative culture. All this means that human life, individually or collectively, cannot be reduced to mere information that is somehow context and substrate independent. To be a conscious being means there must be something that information informs, and that is not a computer program. As Damasio goes on to explain, our particular chemical substrate of life is necessary for the phenomena of feeling, and in humans, reflection and elaboration on the experience of feelings is the basis for much that we hold as humanly distinctive and admirable, including moral and aesthetic judgments, as well as the experience and notions of being and transcendence. Yes, the vision of the Christian transhumanist is not imaginative enough. It is not grounded in the astonishing testimony of reality itself, of just how mysteriously spiritual are the fundamental dynamics of ordinary bodily human life. There is a person in the process, an individual organic being, a unity of mind and matter whose identity and destiny cannot be reduced to mechanical algorithms or to the transhumanist vision of a coldly calculated algebra of salvation. And this is a moral and spiritual mystery, neither reduced to an isolated node by decentering nor blurred into a collective mind, but rather made complete through a unity in multiplicity bound together as the body of Christ. The transhumanist agenda of human self-transcendence is as foolish as someone trying to jump over his own shadow. The entire testimony of human experience is that rectification and redemption cannot be achieved by human initiative alone, but only by the transforming power of an awareness of grace within us, operating through us, working out our salvation with fear and trembling, knowing that God is at work in us, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Like the word human, the word humility shares its root in the Latin word for earth or soil. Yes, we are creatures of the earth, but through Christ, we are participants in the power and process of a cosmic transformation. He is the vine, and we are the branches. And that is the key to the wise use of our emerging technologies. Again, thank you, Christina, for such a beautiful and compelling presentation.
Thank you, William, and thank you all of our respondents. And now, Christina, you have 10 minutes for Rejoinder.
Great. First of all, I'm going to be pretty brief because I love the Q&A part. So roll those questions up. But I want to say it's really gratifying to have such wonderful respondents to my essay. In literary studies, oddly enough, we often just talk at each other, and I just prefer this kind of engagement so much. So thank you. I'll start with Dr. Waters' response. You say, should we look to novels to help us articulate what real hope looks like? Yes, of course. I have devoted my career to helping us understand how badly we need to be good readers of fiction and good writers of it. So 100%. And then when you ask Professor Lake, are you tempted to accuse CTA of heresy? To which my answer is yes, because you are right. I am being too kind. But I want to take this opportunity to be able to explain why I toned it down more than I would have even just 10 years ago. As I was listening to the Turing Church members talk, I was asking myself, if I were them, how would I want my views to be treated by someone else? Because I'm so exhausted by our current political climate where different sides are not really listening to each other. And as I was writing this paper, it occurred to me that I want to dialogue and persuade these folks. And Erica Carlson made this point yesterday. I long for a day when Christians are, in the leading the way and modeling how to have disagreements with each other. And I also am happy to report that desire came out of the discussion in a parallel session on transhumanism this morning. That made me very happy. We have stuff we can still learn from the extremes and still call them heresy, which they are. But in this case, I think it might be to learn the importance of hope in our witness. But I say that only by agreeing with you that hope must not only be evocative, but also truthful. So I agree with that. So I want to ask kind of you, how can we persuade them to our side? I love, to your point, Brent, that to those following the transhumanist agenda, alterity is effectively jettisoned. The other is never encountered as other. Wonderfully put. And although I didn't develop it here, the problem of how we view the other is the primary focus of my book about the ethics of human enhancement technology, the prophets of the post-human. That's how important I think that exact issue is. So I appreciate that you raised that here. And everyone's talking about the body, all three of the respondents, and I could not agree more, the importance of the body. Everything, Brent, that you mentioned about it, and Bill, it's been at the center of my research for 20 years. And let me just say this, transhumanism is a celebration of the post-human. And I follow Kate Hales's definition of post-human. She wrote a great book called How We Became Post-Human. She said, we became post-human the moment we accepted the Turing test as the definition of life, so that life is defined by information patterns and consciousness, not by our material instantiation, our material existence, right? So our embodiment isn't important. And that's the moment we became post-humans. And so our bodies in that definition are, she says, a prosthetic. They're prosthesis that we can manipulate at will. And so not understanding our embodiment as a gift, as central to who we are, as Dr. Hurlbut just talked about, is a huge problem here. And we are really having the chickens come to roost in this issue in our culture right now. And just to identify one example of many, transgenderism, right? If we don't understand the body as a gift, we have no response to transgender issues. So, which is why, to begin to answer your final question, is the hope of resurrection necessarily a hope in the resurrection of the body? I would say definitively yes. But what our bodies will actually look like is anyone's guess. And I prefer to wait to for what he has on offer, rather than keep on tweaking my own miserable body into immortality. So I love the promise of the new heavens and the new earth. And I like there being a kind of a mystery associated with that too. And Dr. Hurlbut, I've long admired your work. And so the first thing I want to say is, how can I get invited to that interdisciplinary stuff you're doing at Stanford? That'd be a dream come true for me. And I think it's said that, definitely. I think it's totally cool that you're the bad guy that Ray Kurzweil mentioned in Transcendent Man, because you're so right on. You're so right on to point out that downloading consciousness into a computer idea is way more complicated and ultimately untenable than most transhumanists have any idea about. And that's why, for me, fighting this fight is always a fight against Gnosticism, because transhumanism necessarily views the body as an impediment to its goals. And they fail to understand that, as you point out, following Damasio, that humans are a complex psychophysical unity. And our language starts in metaphor, which starts in the body. And you make that point. It's a beautiful point. But for them, life is itself defined as information patterns, not biologically. Humans are just machines. I was similarly stunned by this book. I don't know if any of you have read The Physics of Immortality. Oh my gosh, it's so Cartesian. And at the end of the day, Gnosticism, Cartesianism, transhumanism, they all lack that necessary humility that comes from human being made of the dirt, the humus, the earth, as you wonderfully note. And I'd love to discuss Damasio's treatment of consciousness with you sometime, because that's a really important issue. And he is definitely one of those kind of, I believe, it is an emergent property that just sort of comes about one day. And I find that quite problematic. But you're right to use him to make the point that our bodies are essential. And so I wish that more people would understand how complicated we're really talking about. Something like subliming or this kind of having a backup really would be, how complicated and untenable. So good for that. And Dr. Wood, could transhumanism, you ask, as you described it, be in part an overreaction to this long story denying death? My response, yes, yes. I've long held that we need a proper theology of aging and death in order to engage with biotechnology in general and transhumanism in particular. In fact, I want to point out that one of my first entry points into this issue for research in biotechnology was centered on this exact issue. I read Leon Kass's piece in First Things called L'Chaim and Its Limits, Why Not Immortality? And I remember vividly, I was on the beach in June of 2001 when I read it, and it really got my head spinning. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's not a stretch to say that reading that article was the beginning of Prophets of the Posthuman, which I would write 15 years later, because it was one of the first times that my assumptions about death were really challenged. And John, as you know, our assumptions about death and being something that we want to avoid and all that go really deep down inside of our culture, and particularly in American culture with its loving of youth and all of that. So, the first time it was challenged was reading Gulliver's Travels as an undergraduate. But Kass bases the article around this question: if life is good and more is better, should we not regard death as a disease and try to cure it? And part of how he answers it is by saying that living forever in this life is not actually appropriate for human beings as human beings, and it would not be satisfying to us in the way that we assume it would be. And this is what he says, quote, "The human taste for immortality, for the imperishable and the eternal, is not a taste that the biomedical conquest of death could satisfy. We would still be incomplete. We would still lack wisdom. We would still lack God's presence and redemption. Mere continuance will not buy fulfillment," end quote. So I later found this position articulated even more powerfully by Martha Nussbaum, who draws on Homer's Odyssey to argue that physical immortality is not the kind of transcendence that is appropriate for human beings to long for or attain, and therefore it's not going to be satisfying because we're human beings. Now, I don't have time to go into all the ways in which our physical death is thus a gift. You've given us some good beginning points on that. But when pressed, I would say that the primary reason it's a gift is that it prevents us from confusing the creator and the created, right? We're always trying to give birth to ourselves. The original Gnostic fantasy, the original lie from Satan in the garden. Did God say really not to eat that fruit? You're not going to die. It's all there. So my paper and my book stand together to say that when technoscience dupes us into thinking that aging and death are a disease, we take another step toward what we think is self-sufficiency and another step away toward understanding our true need for God. And I think all three of my respondents really understand that that's the primary problem that we're dealing with here theologically. So thank you all for reading my work so carefully. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Christina, and the respondents. We now I don't know, William, if you want to try and turn your camera on for the Q&A and see if it's able to work for a little bit, or if you just want to do audio. But we have time for audience questions. If I might be a little selfish and hijack the first question, transhumanism is a kind of fringe idea that perhaps most of our listeners don't identify with. But sometimes fringe ideas are also helpful for seeing sort of more subtle beliefs that we hold within. I think it's come up a little bit. Christina, you mentioned youth. Several of you mentioned aging. I'm wondering if you could maybe all of you just say a little bit about how these sort of extreme ideas might be more subtly manifest in everyday practices and beliefs in society more comprehensively.
Well, that's how would I answer? Is it Albert Borgman who makes the point? I think it is. He makes the point that technology is just sort of the way that we see the world now. It's the lens through which we see everything, meaning that we just look to technology first to solve all of our problems. And so this transhumanism seems like a totally outre kind of way, but that's all it is. It's just looking to technology first to figure out how to solve our problems. So one could argue that you see it every single day in every single advertisement on, Mac World or something like that. It's like if you open up Mac World and nobody reads it anymore. Online, you're reading Mac World and it says, "Do you have a problem with da 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 da?" And it never occurred to you to think of it as a problem until suddenly they have an app for it, right? Some solution to that particular problem, and he calls that the glamour of technology. And it does affect the way that we're thinking every single day.
To that point, Christina, as the subtle things that happen, we just don't realize how much we're marketed to. And Terry O'Reilly, The Age of Persuasion, he's a Canadian who's done that kind of thing. People are paying attention to the way we're being transformed just by these ideas in the marketplace. So the problem you just described there, if you go back in the 1930s, it was the horrors of gaposis. You didn't want to have a dress that had a little gap in it. You didn't want to have that opening. And so you were marketed a whole set of products, and it goes on and on and on. And we just swim in this ocean of advertising. And so, yeah, technological problem. Of course, there's a fix for that. It's and we make fun of that in the Star Trek series. In the newest one, the Bones character, the doctor, he's always running around saying, "Oh, I've got a solution for that," and he jams him and he's, I've got a solution for that. Every question that comes up, we have this technology. Instead of just saying, "I don't know," Job is a remarkable story because at the end of all of that talking, you come to the place where God speaks. And Job says, "Oh, I think I need to put my hand over my mouth. I talked about things too wonderful for me." That's not our culture.
That's so right. And I want to just elaborate a little bit more on what you just said, because it reminded me of a book by George Saunders that I write about in Prophets. It's called In Persuasion Nation. And it's a book of short stories where he really tackles this issue. And one of them is this 3-page short story called I Can Speak. And it's about a device that it's a salesman. It's a letter that a salesman is writing to a woman who's trying to return the device. And it's a mask that you put on your baby so it can talk before it knows how to talk. Right. Like, because it's just so embarrassing to not be able to have your baby speak when you want the baby to be able to speak. And wouldn't it be better if they could? And the whole thing is just brilliant in talking about the way that we're advertised to and made to think we need things we don't actually need.
The recent movie WALL-E is a classic example of this kind of thing, right? Where you have to leave the planet you've destroyed and to go and need machines to take care of your every need. And that's a marvelous, if you follow the arc of that story, right? It's a marvelous critique of the way we see ourselves in the world. And there are many others. I think this is the brilliance of what you've done here, is to get us to go back in and say, our artists, our poets, our writers, they're at the imaginary edge. And as they were in the 19th century, they are in the 20th century. And I think about C.S. Lewis, he does several things, and J.R.R. Tolkien on death. So Leaf by Niggle by Tolkien and Till We Have Faces by Lewis. Well, I read those as an undergrad and didn't understand what I was reading. Well, I'm nearing the end of the runway, as they say. Every day I'm closer to that. And suddenly those stories begin to make real sense to me. And there's actually hope in that as I turn to my grandchildren and I turn to my family and my community, and I see, oh, there's something really important that I can contribute in here. And in creating those communities where we honor one another, we respect, we have relationship, it's a very countercultural kind of a way of being.
I have a wisdom question here. The question is, may Christians participate in the development of enhancement technologies without making them our eschatological hope? Or I think to put it constructively, how can Christians participate in the development of enhancement technologies without making them our eschatological hope? What is a Christian approach to the development of enhancement technologies, if any?
Well, I think the first thing you have to start, though, is ask the question, enhance for what purpose? And because, I mean, I think increasingly enhancement is becoming its own end. We enhance because we can. And without ever asking question of saying, okay, so why do we want to increase cognitive performance? Why do we want to create physical performance? And you have to really, I think, for Christians, that means is how does this enhance our capacity to love God and neighbor? And if you can't really come up with good answers for that, then maybe this really isn't an enhancement, but it's in fact a distraction from what you really should be trying to achieve. So I think it's really the problem with the transhumanists is, yes, they have a bad eschatology, but they have absolutely no teleology, which is namely, what is the end for which we were created? Because they're trying to transform ourselves into artifacts of our own will.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, Brent, that I learned that from your book, that the current age that we're in, the post-human age, is all about process. It's not even progress anymore. It's just, well, today I want a lizard tail and tongue, and tomorrow I might want some wings, and there's really no end to that.
We focused here this evening on the problematics of transhumanism. There's some really hopeful signs. Reminded of many of the ASA members and fellows will have been part of a conversation of the Cambridge Roundtables that Dave Tom has done. And we've had George Church at Cambridge on in several conversations with us. And each time George mentions that he began, I think, in the early 2000s by hiring a bioethicist in his laboratory. He works on genetic technology and understanding things that are beyond, me as an ecologist, right? They're the skin in part. But here he is saying, I need a bioethicist thinking with me right alongside of this technology. And that's a very, I think it's a fruitful approach and a hopeful one. It's not everything bleak, because sometimes we get this dichotomy, Christians against the everybody else and us against them. And Christina, you've said to us here that we need to try an open conversation more than seeing it just as opposition.
William, it looks like you're unmuted. Would you like to contribute to this question?
I think what was said was adequate and good.
Excellent. All right, I think this is a quick answer here. The role of fiction seems important in engaging this kind of Pelagian vision. Wendell Berry's works come to mind in this regard. Are there other authors that you might also recommend whose fiction is helpful in pushing back on this tendency? I think maybe a quick answer without elaboration could help.
Gosh, that's like asking a lit prof. Okay, so what's your favorite book? My recommendations are all in my book, so you can just look at the table of contents and get my recommendations. But in that book, I deliberately tried to draw on non-science fiction texts because they equally have as much to teach us about what the good life should actually look like, right? Because that's the question that the transhumanist vision cannot answer. Just having a longer life doesn't mean it's a good life. Just having a life free of suffering doesn't even mean that that's the good life, right? Because if you aren't dealing with your soul in a kind of significant way and learning how to love, then that's not a good life. So Marilyn Robinson, along with Wendell Berry, is a great choice for this. All of her novels are really fantastic, and I kind of read them as a response to transhumanism at the end of Prophets. But yeah, I mean, I could just, goodness, just, yeah, there's no end to this question. I'm just going to shut up.
How about John, Brent, William? Would you want to comment any fiction authors that have been influential for you in thinking about this?
Just a couple of quick ones I'd mention would be Wallace Stegner, particularly the Crossing to Safety, and also Iris Murdoch, because I think what Iris Murdoch reminds us of is that actually the good life is actually a pretty ordinary life.
Now, I was thinking, it jumped into mind, Proust was a neuroscientist. Jonah Lehrer, he actually trained in the humanities, but worked in a neuroscience lab for a number of years. And he takes 19th century artists and goes through them one after another and just celebrates the conversation between the humanities and the sciences in that century. And I found that one quite helpful.
Maybe a question related. Can you talk about C.P. Snow's Two Cultures? Specifically, how do the humanities and the natural sciences relate? Also, where does theology fit between the humanities and the natural sciences?
Sorry, Geoffrey, was that to me or that was to Christine?
I think it was to the group insofar as, I think probably, John, your paper brought it out the most, but it's probably implicit in several of the responses.
Well, I'm a partisan on this one, so I should defer to the others.
And if there's nothing to say, we can move on. It's probably a bigger question.
It's huge. That's a huge question. I mean, you could write, and books have been kind of written about it, right? The territories of science and religion immediately comes to mind by somebody help me with this. And Peter Harrison is a good look at that and a good attempt to answer that. Interdisciplinary work is tricky and difficult, but one of the things that makes it so necessary is that the way you see the world is through metaphor, through a certain lens, and you can't answer those kinds of questions through science and pure fact. And so that's where the intersection takes place, is how is your vision of the world changed, challenged, whatever, by what you're reading or thinking about.
So, Geoffrey, is there time for just a brief story?
Do you know how to tell brief stories, John? Go for it.
This came in graduate school. I'm in my PhD at Berkeley, and I'm talking with my major prof one afternoon. We're sitting outside, and we're having a conversation. And he says to me, John, you're the only grad student I have or ever have had that talks about these kinds of questions. And it turns out he had an undergraduate degree in philosophy. And, mine came out of a Christian liberal arts background. But I found in places, at every place in the academy, I find people who are engaging these conversations. And they're aware of the issues. And so whatever we can do to encourage and enhance those kinds of conversations, invite people into that conversation. People told me, "Oh, you're going to Berkeley. Be careful." That kind of narrative. I didn't find anything to be careful about there. I found inquiring minds and interesting people who were fully engaged and wanting to know. And there's a lot more to that story, but not tonight.
That was pretty short. Well done, John. All right, here's a question and an on-point story as well. Thank you. Question: what do secular transhumanists think about Christian transhumanists?
I don't know. Does anybody know?
Well, if
above my pay grade.
Go ahead. I mean, if they think of them at all, I think they see them as a kind of eccentric group of people that have this curious need to try to hang on to something that they'd be better off jettisoning. So I think kind of see them as half-hearted transhumanists at best. Because, I mean, look, a true transhumanist is basically going to be Nietzsche on steroids.
Yes.
And you don't really have any reasons why. I mean, the transhumanist is going to create this world, and they're right. They'd have no need for humility, because humility is simply going to get in the way. So I think basically I think they find Christian transhumanists as objects of bemusement at best.
Another question, I think this must be coming from a specific point in the papers, one of the papers that I don't recall. Was C.S. Lewis directly critiquing Fedorov in that hideous strength?
I don't know that either, but that's a possibility. That had never occurred to me. I just learned about Russian cosmism when I was writing this paper. So but that is a definite possibility. Man knew a lot of things. So,
Christina, you and I talked about Lewis and that hideous strength and the influence of communism, which was in the air. Malcolm Muggeridge is another intellectual who was quite taken with the communist project. So it'd be very interesting to explore that and see if there are connections there. Lewis would likely have been aware of it.
All right, another question.
A little comment on communism and transhumanism. J.B.S. Haldane, famous biologist, geneticist, proposed that we genetically modify ourselves culturally as well, so that our culture would increase because our intelligence would increase. And he suggested we model ourselves after Marx and Lenin and Engels. But then he got disenchanted with communism, and so he revised that to Lincoln and Pasteur. So, how you used your tools, even if they were there, is always going to have assumptions that are much below science smuggled in.
Another question about secular transhumanism. Can secular transhumanism aid Christian theology by suggesting possible plausible worlds that, even if inaccessible to human science, show the logical and even physical possibilities of Christian eschatology, e.g. a world without death in our physical world? It's a long question. You may want to try and read it in the browser if it's available to you.
Yeah, I can't see the browser, but I think that's a good question, because again, I'm interested in. Oh, there you go.
Thanks, Max.
I'm interested in what we can learn from transhumanists and from Christian transhumanists, as always, as I said earlier. And when I was faulting them for not being imaginative enough, it's pretty imaginative. Like this Physics of Immortality book that I mentioned earlier. I mean, my goodness, it kind of blew my mind, the things that it was suggesting. And there was a paper earlier today in the transhumanist parallel session, and I can't remember, sorry, the man who presented it, but he was talking about, I can't remember his name, but he was talking about this, and it was a really excellent point that he made that just left my brain. It's late in the evening, right? I'm like, it'll come back to me in a second.
To that point, Christina, I think in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, a number of articles on transhumanism there over the last several years that would be great starting points to enter this conversation. I found them fruitful. And another place is I just picked up and listened to Alan Jacobs out of Baylor in his new book called Breaking Bread with the Dead, A Reader's Guide to a More Tranquil Mind. And he talks about creating conversations and doing that with people who are dead. And if you don't like what they're saying, you just close the book, right? You just close the story, and it reduces the emotional content. I think that's really an important thing, because it feels like with transhumanism, it's so present to us and contemporary. It's very sharp, but these past writers, I think, have some very interesting insights that we can sit and ponder, and especially those that we don't agree with, and trying to use them to sharpen our thinking, which I think was the point here that the question was.
Let's see, a few more questions about transhumanism. What are your thoughts on transhuman projects? There were two referenced, Moderna and DARPA.
Well, by DARPA, you mean the military applications of this technology? Because I'm not familiar with that specific.
Yeah, I think what they might be going at is this whole enhancement possibility. So, the cyborg ways, cyborg warriors, that side of things. I'm not sure either on the question, but that might be the direction it's headed.
Yeah.
Christina, I think this is a paper for you, or a question for you, excuse me. You made a strong connection between grace and contingency. Can you elaborate? In particular, what do you mean by contingency and what makes it so important?
Yeah, that's Albert Borgman's point, that he says that the more you try to get in control of basically eliminating contingency from your world, so accidents, things that are basically out of your control, that's what the definition of contingency is there, that the more you, first of all, think of the world that way, as that you need to control for it, the more miserable that you're going to make yourself. But the more you actually do have control, the less you understand your need for grace. And so that's why they're in an inverse relationship. So Borgman makes the point that it's actually suffering and pain and things in the world that cause us to understand our need for grace, that we're not self-sufficient and autonomous, as Brent was talking about in his response. Love comes from understanding that. Like, we can only love each other when we really, truly understand our need for grace from others and ultimately from God. So that's how those are related. Did that answer that question?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
So I think we're just about out of time for this session. Thank you, all of you, Christina, John, Brent, William, for a stimulating conversation. A bold affirmation, I think, of the body and the hope of the resurrection, the Christian hope. So thank you for wrapping up this interdisciplinary conversation and conference on a very positive note.